Okay, this one is very, very interesting to me because this dish is in present day. This dish is associated with being like very high class, and very finicky to make. Apparently, it's not always been that way. Let's find out, chat. Let's find out.
Beef bourguignon is one of the iconic dishes of French cuisine and is held in high esteem. But that wasn't always the case, because in the 19th century, it was actually just a way for poor people to use up leftovers. So that is how I'm going to be making it today, using the first printed recipe for the dish from 1885.
1885?
So thank you to Thrive Market for sponsoring this video as we make
1885? Damn. Also, good eye once again, Tapper. My gosh. Hi, Caldeo.
beef bourguignon of the French peasantry. This time on Tasting History.
Let's go. I love this channel so much.
The recipe that I'm using today has a lot in common with modern beef bourguignon, but it also has several differences. First of all, it is a lot simpler, and second of all, it is not a stew, but rather a sauce that you would add meat to after cooking.
Oh, that's a massive difference, actually. Yeah. Because this dish is usually... You stew this for such a long time. I'm very interested to see how this turns out.
It comes from an 1885 French cookbook, which translates to Good Cuisine for All, or The Art of Living Well on a Budget. And it's included in the chapter entitled The True Way to Make Use of Leftovers.
Okay.
It says, Boeuf bourguignon. Brown a piece of pork belly diced in butter, add a little flour, salt, and pepper, and add a mixture of half broth and half red wine. Add a few small white onions, well peeled, let cook for 20 minutes, then add to this sauce your stewed beef cut into slices. When the meat is well heated through, serve with the sauce.
Interesting.
So it's missing things like carrots and mushrooms and potatoes, which you'll often see in modern versions, but it does have the usual onions and, of course, the red wine, which is what makes it bourguignon. Now, this recipe is supposed to be made using leftovers, so I need to make something to have left over. Now, the recipe says that it should be made with stewed beef, but if you have like roast brisket or short ribs or something like that that's been cooked in another way, that's fine. It'll work as well as long as it is really nice and tender. But I am going to be making stewed beef, so for that, what I'm going to use is 3 pounds or 1.3 kilograms of beef. Things like chuck roast, short ribs, oxtail, anything really that is usually on the tougher side that will go well with a long simmering process.
Oh my god, PepsiCo,
then 2 teaspoons of salt, a half teaspoon of black pepper, 2 tablespoons of clarified butter or olive oil, 1 quart or 1 liter of beef broth, and herbs tied into a bouquet garni. I'm using thyme, rosemary, and bay. So first season the meat with the salt and pepper, and then let it sit out for about 30 minutes or in the fridge overnight. And you can have this all in one big piece, or you can cut it up into smaller pieces like cubes, depending on the size of your pot. Then melt the clarified butter or heat the olive oil in a large pot over a high heat, and once melted, add in the beef and let it get a bit of a sear. Move the pieces around so each piece gets pretty well seared. It should take no more than 2 or 3 minutes. Then pour in the beef broth along with enough water to fully cover the meat. Toss in that bouquet of herbs and let the pot come to a boil and skim off any foam that rises to the top once it starts boiling. Then reduce to a low boil and set the lid on the pot. Now, depending on what cut you're using and the size of the piece, it can take anywhere from an hour and a half to 4 hours to cook all the way through. Something larger, it's going to take 4 hours. These smaller pieces, only about an hour and a half. The important thing is you want it nice and tender and pretty much fully cooked through now, because we're not going to cook it later on in the process. And if, while it is cooking, you find yourself in need of a snack, might I suggest one of the delicious and healthy snacks from today's sponsor,
make sure it's cooked all the way through.
With the start of the new year, it's usually thrivemarket.com to save about 2 cups of Miller. Now, once your beef is fully cooked, remove it from the pot, and then you'll want to save about 2 cups of the cooking liquid, as that is one of the ingredients that you'll need to make the remainder of the recipe. Of course, if you want to just use fresh beef broth, that works as well. In addition to that, what you'll need is 2 tablespoons or 30 grams of butter, a half pound or 225 grams of diced pork belly or lardo, 3 tablespoons or 25 grams of flour, a large pinch of salt, a quarter teaspoon of pepper, and 2 cups or 475 milliliters of red burgundy wine, or more. Frankly, you might just end up using the entire bottle. and then about a cup and a half of small white onions. And these can be pearl onions or just standard onions if they're pretty small, or if they're larger onions, then just chop them up. So the first thing to do is to melt the butter in a pot, and then over high heat, you can add the diced pork belly. Move it around as it cooks and let most of the fat render out. It should take about 8 to 10 minutes, and the meat on the pork should get nice and brown. Then you want to lower the heat and remove the pieces of pork belly from the pot. Then raise the heat to medium-high and add in the flour, and quickly stir it into the melted fat in the butter, and continue to stir so it doesn't burn. Now at first it's going to be a very pale color, but after about 5 minutes it will darken up. You're looking for a nice brown color, and it should give off a nutty aroma.
Yeah, that's a good
Once you're there, you can add in the salt and the pepper and give it a good stir, and then add the broth and the red wine. And this will deglaze the bottom of the pot, and you can scrape the bottom for any brown bits that might have burnt off.
That's all the flavor.
Here you can also add the pork belly back into the pot. Then let this come to a gentle boil, and then add the onions in. Then you want to just leave it to boil for 20 to 30 minutes so the onions get nice and tender. It'll start to thicken during that time, and if you wish, don't be afraid to add the rest of that red wine. So again, this is a bit different from the modern beef bourguignon, because today you would typically be slow cooking the meat in the wine itself.
Yes, you would.
So that makes me question, when in history did beef bourguignon go from being
That's the question now, isn't it?
To a stew?
Yeah. That's the question now, isn't it? I'm very curious.
It's hard to date the creation of beef bourguignon because the actual dish has a pretty broad definition. In 1867, Le Grand Dictionnaire Universel just said bourguignon, culinary art, qualification given to several dishes prepared with wine. Boeuf bourguignon. So if it's just beef prepared with wine, well, that could be pretty much anything. I mean, the ancient Romans had beef in wine.
That's a broad definition.
That doesn't really help. So maybe to narrow down my search, I will look within France and look for some other key ingredients besides the wine. Well, that would bring me to something like the dish aigre douce, which was popular in the 14th and 15th centuries.
What?
One English language recipe for the dish from around 1420 says take pork or beef, whichever you like, and cut it thin against the grain, then broil it brown a little, and then mince it like venison. Chop it in pieces and cast it into a pot, and do that through fresh broth. And this meat was cooked with onions, wine, and different herbs. So it's not too far off from the dish that we're making today, except that because it was a medieval recipe, it also included spices like saffron and cinnamon, and there are some recipes that even included raisins. Now, all of those ingredients would have been for the recipe. It also included spices like saffron and cinnamon, and there are some recipes that even included raisins.
Why? Why? Cast it into a pot, modern cookbook readers. Yeet. Yeah, why the raisins? Why the raisins?
Now, all of those ingredients would have been for mostly the wealthier people. So I can see the common people cooking a dish that is very much like the beef bourguignon that we're making today. But still, it's not exactly the same thing, and so I'm not sure that it counts. What is clear is that, contrary to what you'll often read online, beef bourguignon was not originally created as a way to tenderize poor cuts of meat. Often you'll read that the slow cooking in wine was a way to make cheap cuts become easier to eat.
That's what I've heard.
And while in theory that's true, it's not the original reason. First off, the cuts that we often think of as cheap cuts now were not always thought of as cheap cuts. Things like ribs, chuck, shank, you would find all of those cuts on the table of a medieval king. The theory also falls apart because when the dish originally was called bourguignon, it wasn't actually cooked in wine, but rather it was a sauce to put on the meat. One of the earliest references to this sauce by the name bourguignon comes from the great French chef Marie-Antoine Carême, who included a recipe for sauce à la bourguignotte in l'art de la cuisine française au 19e siècle, or the art of French cooking in the 19th century. The recipe...
Max's French is so good. Like, holy cow. Max's French is so good. Oh my goodness.
Which comes from 1847, has many of the hallmarks of the modern version, like the herbs, the onions, and the wine, specifically Volnay, which was is a very nice wine from Burgundy, but it wasn't meant for beef. Rather, it was actually meant for eel served with crayfish tails and mushrooms. But even then, they were not cooked in it, but rather it was just used as a sauce to elevate a fairly plain piece of meat, in this case, eel. But the common people were using beef. And it was, for the most part, a dish of the common people. A dish meant to elevate last night's leftovers, like the way that I will often add some peanut sauce to my leftover pad thai. Delicious, perhaps. Remarkable? Not really.
I mean, whatever
At least
works.
not until the early 20th century, when the father of modern French haute cuisine, Auguste Escoffier, began serving it at his restaurant.
There's a name. There's a name I'm very, very familiar with. Escoffier. I have had to learn so many techniques from this motherfucker while at culinary school. Like, goddamn. One of our restaurants on campus was named after him. Like, good Christ.
At the Ritz Hotel. Not my leftover pad thai with peanut sauce.
Yeah.
The beef bourguignon. In his cookbook, Le Guide Culinaire, first published in 1903, Escoffier includes a recipe for garniture à la bourguignon, meant to be served with joints of beef. It was prepared with pork belly, butter, onions, and mushrooms, all cooked in a good red wine.
Yeah.
And then this would have likely been poured over or served alongside quality cuts of beef.
There we
Still
go.
not the stew that we know today, but it was what put beef bourguignon on the culinary map, at least in Paris. Because only a year or two later, you really start seeing the dish appearing on menus not only of Escoffier's restaurant, but at bistros all over the city.
Yeah,
and
that's when it
at some point,
starts.
around 1910 or so, it transformed from a sauce or a garnish into a stew.
Also,
What's
that's
interesting
when the
is
switch
that
was
the
made.
dish actually probably already existed as a stew much earlier, but under a different name.
Really?
In 1840, in a newspaper from Cornwall, England, of all places, there was a mention of tongue in ragout à la bourguignon. Unfortunately, it doesn't really give any details to exactly what this ragout was, but it would have been a stew of some sort, and the name bourguignon leads me to believe it was probably based in red wine. What is definite is that by World War I, beef bourguignon was a stew. In 1915, the Morning Post in London had an article about the different foods being served to the French soldiers in the trenches and how it was different from what the British Tommies were eating, things like bully beef and hardtack. The French soldiers were said to...
Yes! There it is, chat! There it is! Wait.
Tommies were eating things like bully beef and hardtack.
Yeah! Clack, clack. There it is, soy jack pointing. Yep.
The French soldiers were said to always have a number of fresh beef dishes available to them, including boeuf bourguignon, which was exceedingly appetizing, achieved by manipulation of the beef from the stew, which of course is always cut up into small lumps.
I always love Dylan's one of Dylan's quips about hardtack. Y'all really said Ford tough. These are roofing tiles.
Stated that as regards boiled beef, one who has eaten it with the French soldiers never enjoys it again anywhere else. It had become a beloved staple of French cuisine, at least in Paris, because in a 1936 edition of Grand Goussier, a journal of medical gastronomy, it says the dish was actually rarely made in the region where it got its name anymore, possibly because it had changed so much over the years. First of all, let us speak of beef à la bourguignon, a preparation of grand style, which is not, moreover, special to Burgundy, for it is made far more often in Paris than in that region, where it appears almost daily on the menus of wine merchants, where it is designated under the name boeuf bourguignon. By some accounts, outside of the French bistro, beef bourguignon was actually disappearing altogether.
Really?
In 1930, it was written that the Petite Parisienne has made the lamentable discovery that the old-fashioned French dishes, the good old family pot-au-feu, the friendly ragout, the boeuf en daube, The merengue, the bourguignon, are becoming obsolete.
Oh,
he attributes it to the
interesting.
disappearance of the kitchen, a feature of the French housing problem. Time brings its revenges. Once it was the taunt of our Gallic neighbors that we English had only 3 dishes: beef, mutton, and hash. Shall we live to see the French gourmet visiting these shores in search of the last-named delicacy? No, I don't think we would live to see that, because the reports of the death of beef bourguignon were greatly exaggerated, because it was just such a beloved dish by then.
Fun fact, in Gallipoli, when there were lulls in the fighting, Australian and Turkish soldiers would trade rations. The Turkish enjoyed the bully beef, which was hated by the Australians because they rarely got meat rations, while the Aussies highly valued the Turkish spices. Oh, that's pretty cool. Oh, that's really neat, actually. Thank you, Tapper. Talk about stretching $1. This is some spandex level stretching.
Before World War II, recipes for it had crossed the pond and were being printed in America. In 1940, a number of newspapers ran a recipe for beef bourguignon, making a delicacy out of beef stew. Though perhaps no one did as much to revive the reputation of beef bourguignon than did the wife of an American diplomat who visited France after World War II and became enamored with French cuisine. I'm, of course, talking about the great Julia Child.
Yes! Yes! Julia Child, let's go! Hell yeah! One of the great inspirations, chat. Oh my goodness, love Julia Child. Love Julia Child.
Featured the dish along with Simone Beck and Louisette Berthold in their cookbook Mastering the Art of French Cooking.
Yes!
This introduced the dish to many people who had never come across it before, especially when following...
I cannot understate how important Julia Child was to changing how Americans viewed home cooking. Because it used to just be viewed as a chore, something not worth fussing over. Julia Child turned it around, essentially. She was the one who sort of revitalized that whole, like, cooking is an art form mentality. Like, genuinely. Oh my goodness.
Following the success of the cookbook, Julia Child featured the dish in one of the early episodes of her cooking show, The French Chef.
Beef bourguignon, French beef stew in red wine.
And since its appearance on The French Chef, the popularity of beef bourguignon has only grown, and Julia Child's recipe has really kind of become the standard.
The standard, yeah.
Beef that is slow cooked with different vegetables in red wine. And it was definitely a stew, a far cry from the sauce that was made.
The best part about Julia Child is how she would always show the mistakes and errors and adapt it on the fly. Yes, exactly.
Made in the homes of economical 19th century French peasants or the homes of economical 2020s American me. So once your sauce is cooked for 20 to 30 minutes, it should have thickened up just a bit, and then you can add in the already cooked leftover beef. Stir that in and continue to cook on medium just until the beef has warmed about 5 to 10 minutes. And here we are, the original beef bourguignon of 19th century.
Damn it, I'm hungry now. Why do I do this to myself, chat? My goodness.
France. Now it smells absolutely wonderful, and I mean, how could it not? It's onions and beef and wine cooking. Let's give it a taste. That is so flavorful.
Oh.
The beef just falls apart. Now again, there's not as much broth because it's not a stew. There's
not a lot.
Just some sauce on it. The beef really kind of soaks it all up. But it is not lacking in flavor at all. But the flavor is different than a modern beef bourguignon.
This is very, very different.
It is definitely more wine forward, and I feel like it's not as sweet. And I think that's because it doesn't have things like carrots to add sweetness, and very often today, sugar is added. This doesn't have sugar. All it has is the onion, so I'm actually going to try one of these onions.
This is why I use pearl onions for this. It's so much easier.
I like that better than the beef, even.
That's so much flavor. Yeah, my God.
That is delicious. So yeah, this is the dish for the winter to make, for the summer anytime really. Beef bourguignon. Make the modern kind, make Julia Child's recipe, or make this version. They are different, but they're similar. They're both delicious, and I will see you next time.
Absolutely incredible, my gosh. Absolutely perfect little bite-sized flavor packages. Exactly. See, Tapper gets it.